I was never really into hiking, but back then, it seemed like the kind of thing that would make sense. It was the summer of 2018, and I was trying to break out of the rut my routine had me in. I was 24, stuck in a soul-sucking office job, and my buddy Luke kept insisting we do something different. "You need to disconnect, man. Let's hit the outdoors." He said it like it was an invitation to paradise, but I knew he just wanted to explore another trail for his Instagram. Eventually, I gave in, and we picked the national park, a place known for its breathtaking views and relatively safe trails. Luke had been there before, but it was all new to me. We got there early in the morning, backpacks loaded with supplies and a thermos of strong coffee, ready to spend the day hiking. The trail started off easy. The sounds of birds, the smell of the trees, that feeling of being in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't so bad. I'll admit. We talked about random stuff, as usual, laughing at our inside jokes. Around 11 a.m., we stopped to rest at a high point where we could see the valley below. While Luke was snapping photos, I noticed something weird. There was a figure standing, almost perfectly still, at the beginning of the path we'd come down. It looked like a man, or at least it seemed like it, wearing a dark coat, even though it was pretty hot out. He was far away, but I could tell he wasn't just another hiker. I stared for a few seconds, waiting for him to move, but nothing happened. "Everything all right?" Luke asked, and I hesitated before answering. "I think someone's following us." Luke laughed, thinking I was overreacting. "Relax, it's probably just another hiker. People come through here all the time." I tried to convince myself he was right, but something didn't sit right. The guy wasn't just standing there, he seemed like he was watching us. When we started walking again, I checked over my shoulder a few times, but he didn't show up again. Still, the feeling that we weren't alone stuck with me. The trail began getting denser, with tall trees blocking out the sunlight. Luke was ahead, walking confidently, while I found myself way too focused on the sounds around us, leaves rustling, branches snapping. I tried to ignore it, but my steps started getting quicker, like something was pushing me to get the hell out of there. About halfway through, we found a side trail that led to a small waterfall, so we decided to take a break. The sound of the water was calming, but my mind was still stuck on that figure. While Luke set up a tripod for more photos, I wandered off to explore. That's when, between the trees, I saw something that made my heart race. A few feet from where we were, there was a footprint. It didn't seem like much, except that it was fresh and pointed in our direction. Luke came over when he saw my face. "Dude, what now?" I showed him the footprint, and he just shrugged. Someone must have passed through here before us. But I knew that didn't make sense. The ground was still damp, like the print had been made just minutes ago. After the footprint, I got more and more on edge. I tried to hide it from Luke, but he noticed. "You're really paranoid today, man. Maybe it's the lack of coffee." He laughed, trying to lighten the mood, but it didn't help. We decided to head back to the main trail and keep going, but this time, the silence between us felt heavy. The feeling of being watched just kept growing, and the forest seemed darker, like the day was slipping away faster than it should have. Every sound, every movement in the shadows, made my heart race. When we passed a clearing, I saw something that froze me in my tracks, the same figure from before, now much closer. He was in the middle of the trail, standing still, with his back to us, like he was waiting. I signaled Luke to stop. He looked confused, but when he saw the man, he froze too. "Who is he?" Luke whispered, and I just shook my head, unable to answer. We stood there, motionless, trying to figure out what to do. After what felt like an eternity, the man started to move, but not toward us. He stepped off the trail and disappeared into the woods next to it. "See?" He laughed. "It's fine," Luke tried to downplay it, but I knew it wasn't. Something was off. Who walks like that, without a backpack or anything, in the middle of an isolated trail? And why didn't he bother to explain himself or even look at us? Reluctantly, we kept going, but every step felt like it was taking us to a place I wanted to avoid. As we walked, I started to notice that the silence in the forest felt wrong. There were no more birds chirping or leaves rustling in the wind. It was like everything around us was holding its breath. Waiting. Luke finally stopped pretending everything was okay. "This is weird, huh?" he murmured, almost embarrassed to admit it. I just nodded, quickening my pace. That's when we noticed something strange. The trail was starting to change. The markers, small painted wooden signs, had just disappeared. "I'm pretty sure we were supposed to turn here," Luke said, pointing to a side trail, but the place felt completely unfamiliar. It was like the forest had shifted. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A sharp snap, like branches being crushed, came from our right. We both looked at the same time but saw nothing. "It's probably an animal," Luke tried to say, but his voice was trembling. We started walking faster, almost running, but the sound followed us. With every turn, every step, it felt like it was right next to us, hidden in the thick brush. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I looked behind us and saw something that almost made me scream. Between the trees, there was a hand gripping the trunk of one of them, just a hand, pale and still. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered, grabbing Luke by the arm. For the first time, he didn't argue. From that point on, we weren't walking anymore, we were running. The forest seemed endless, like we were stuck in a maze. Every time we looked back, it felt like shadows were moving, but nothing concrete. My heart was pounding, and Luke, who was always so confident, now looked as terrified as I did. "Why didn't anyone warn us this place was like this?" he gasped between shallow breaths, but I didn't have an answer. After a few minutes, we saw something that gave us hope, a trail marker, painted red on a tree. We headed in that direction, but the more we walked, the more I realized the markers were wrong, leading to dead ends or loops that brought us right back to where we started. The tension peaked when the sound came back, but this time, it was more. It wasn't just branches snapping, it was footsteps, heavy and slow, like someone was closing in on us, taking their time. Luke grabbed my arm tightly and pointed ahead. In the middle of the trail, the figure was there again. But now it was clearer. The man wore a hood that covered his face. And he seemed bigger than before, like he was somehow growing. He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying us, before taking a step forward. Without thinking, we grabbed our backpacks and ran in the opposite direction, completely ignoring the trail. The only goal was to get out of there, no matter how. The forest seemed to be closing in more and more, like the trees had decided to conspire against us. We rarely saw the sky, and the sound of our heavy footsteps was muffled by the damp ground covered in leaves. Luke started mumbling something about being lost, his voice full of panic. I tried to focus, but it was hard when I could feel that constant weight on my back, like someone was just a few feet away. Suddenly, I tripped on an exposed root and fell. Luke pulled me up, but it was right then that we heard it. It wasn't just footsteps or branches snapping anymore, it was a guttural sound, almost human, like a groan coming from all directions. We froze. "This isn't normal," Luke said, more to himself than to me. When we finally forced ourselves to move again, it was like the forest was reacting. The groaning got louder, closer. We ran as fast as we could, dodging branches and bushes that scraped at us like they were trying to stop us from leaving. That's when Luke screamed and stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed ahead, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A small circle of stones, perfectly arranged, with markings scratched on the ground. It didn't look natural, it looked like it had been made by someone. But the worst part was what was in the center, our thermos, the one we'd left by the waterfall hours ago. "How the hell did this get here?" Luke asked, but the answer was obvious. Someone was leading us, manipulating us. We couldn't stay there for long. The presence of the circle and the thermos felt like it was suffocating the air around us. "We need to keep moving, now," I said, pulling Luke along, but he hesitated. Something in his eyes had changed, a mix of confusion and fear I'd never seen before. We started running again, but it felt pointless. The forest wrapped around us like a heavy blanket, and I was sure we were just going in circles. Then we heard something we couldn't ignore, a laugh. Low, drawn out, full of something I can only describe as malice. We stopped immediately, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed to be everywhere. This can't be happening, Luke murmured, almost crying. Before I could respond, a movement to our left caught our attention. The figure was back, but this time, it wasn't standing still. It was walking slowly toward us, long strides, taking its time, like it knew we had nowhere to run. For the first time, I got a good look at its face. It wasn't exactly human. The features were wrong, like someone had tried to mold a face from blurred memories. The eyes, small and deep-set, seemed to glow unnaturally. That's when I realized, no matter how fast we ran, we weren't getting out of here as long as that thing wanted us to stay. Luke grabbed my arm tightly, like he needed some kind of anchor to keep from falling apart right there. We need to get out of here, man. No matter what, he whispered, his voice breaking. But I already knew running wasn't enough. The figure kept getting closer, each of its steps echoing inside my head. That's when I remembered something my mom always used to say: if you get lost, go back to basics. Mark your path, find landmarks, and never let fear control you. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the feeling of panic, and started tearing pieces off my shirt, tying them to branches along the way. Luke looked at me like I was crazy, but soon enough, he started helping. The weird thing was, as we marked our way, the forest seemed to change. The trees, which had felt so suffocating and dense, started to open up, and sunlight began breaking through the leaves. The sound of footsteps behind us kept going, but now it felt farther away. That's when we saw it, a clearing in the woods, revealing the main trail, the one we'd started on hours ago. We ran as fast as we could, almost tripping from the relief when our feet hit the packed dirt. But before we could celebrate, I looked back at the entrance of the forest. The figure was standing there, like it couldn't follow us past that boundary. It didn't do anything, just watched us. But before it disappeared into the shadows, I heard the laugh again, low and dragged out, like a promise. We made it to the parking lot without looking back again. Our legs were shaking, and the air felt lighter, but the sense of danger still clung to us. Luke threw his backpack on the ground and sat down, trying to catch his breath. "What the hell was that?" he said, looking at me like I had the answer. But I didn't know either. It all felt too real to just be paranoia or some twisted prank. I looked around, expecting to see someone, another hiker, a park ranger, anyone, but there was no one. The park was empty, like we were the only ones there all day. We just wanted to leave, and that's exactly what we did, without saying another word. To this day, I can't explain what happened that day. Luke never brought it up again, and honestly, I'm not even sure if he truly believes what we saw. But I do. Sometimes, at night, I think back to that laugh and the figure standing at the forest's edge. I don't know what it wanted or why it let us go. But since then, I've always stayed away from national parks, trails, and anywhere I could end up alone in the middle of nowhere. Some places, I think, just weren't meant for us to be in. And if one day you feel like you're being watched, even when no one's around, trust your instincts. Because maybe, it's not just in your head.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've always been the kind of person who believed that solitude was great for creativity. Writing has been my passion since college, but lately, it felt like the words just wouldn't come. So, at the beginning of last winter, I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a solo retreat. The Airbnb listing seemed perfect. A wooden cabin, surrounded by tall pine trees, almost untouched by civilization. It was a simple place, but cozy, with a porch that overlooked a valley that looked straight out of a postcard. When I got there, I felt almost euphoric with the complete silence and the lack of any modern distractions. No Wi-Fi, no close neighbors, just me, my laptop, and the sound of the wind in the trees. For the first few days, the peace felt amazing. I'd wake up early, brew some strong coffee on the old kitchen stove, and spend my mornings writing. But by the third night, I started feeling watched. It's hard to explain. It was like, even inside the cabin, something was following me with its eyes. I decided to ignore it and focus on my work. But the next day, while walking along the trail that led to the valley, I noticed something strange. On top of a nearby hill, there was a house almost hidden by the trees. It was small and seemed abandoned, with broken windows and an air of desolation. But for a moment, I swear I saw someone standing on the porch, just watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but the figure was tall and still, which made me uneasy. I quickly picked up the pace back to the cabin, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. That night, the feeling of being watched grew even stronger. After dinner, I sat on the porch to relax and look at the stars. But I couldn't focus on the beauty of the sky. My eyes kept being drawn to that hill. Everything was quiet, but I felt like something was out there. I decided to go inside, close the curtains, and force myself to believe it was just mental exhaustion. Before bed, I checked all the doors and windows, something I don't usually do. But for some reason, it felt necessary that night. Still, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scraping outside. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area around the cabin, but saw nothing. I went back to bed, trying to tell myself it was just the wind. The next morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. In the snow around the cabin, there were footprints that weren't mine. They circled the house, stopping at every window, like someone had been inspecting the place. I stared at those marks for a while, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe a hunter or someone lost in the woods. Still, it was strange that the person hadn't knocked on the door or left any sign other than the footprints. I spent the day feeling uneasy, torn between going back to town or staying and trying to ignore the discomfort. In the end, I decided to stay. After all, I came there to focus, and I wasn't going to let a little paranoia ruin my retreat. That night, I was determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. I tried distracting myself by watching a CI movie on my laptop, but it didn't last long. The battery died, and I sat there in the dark, listening to the wind blow through the cracks in the cabin. That's when I heard it again, the dragging sound, but this time, it seemed to be coming from the porch. My heart raced. I grabbed the flashlight again, but hesitated before opening the door. When I finally mustered up the courage, there was nothing there, just the sound of the wind and the snow that had piled up. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A dry twig, carefully placed in the shape of a circle, right in the middle of the porch. At that point, sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, holding a kitchen knife in my hand, and keeping my eyes glued to the front door. When the sun finally came up, my head was pounding from trying to find an explanation. I decided to go out and investigate, following the footprints that led up to the hill. I climbed to where I had seen the house the day before, but the place looked even stranger up close. The wood on the walls was rotting, and the windows, which had seemed broken before, were now completely covered with scraps of old cloth. I knocked on the door, just to make sure no one actually lived there. Nothing. But as I turned to leave, I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something in the highest window. A face, partially covered by the cloth. It wasn't moving, but the eyes seemed to follow every step I took. I ran back to the cabin, my heart racing and my mind in chaos. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was my imagination, a strange shadow reflected by the daylight. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something, or someone, in that house, and it was clearly aware of my presence. When I entered the cabin, I noticed a strange smell, like wet earth and burnt wood. I didn't remember ever smelling that before, and it was strong enough to make me feel nauseous. I decided to open all the windows to air out the place, but when I opened the last one, I noticed that the old armchair in the living room was facing the door. I was absolutely sure I had left it facing the fireplace. That was enough to convince me I wasn't alone. I grabbed my things, determined to leave as fast as possible, but when I reached the door, I noticed something that made me freeze. The key, which I always left hanging by the entrance, was gone. I searched the whole cabin, every drawer, every corner. Nothing. It was like someone had taken it while I was gone. Panic started to rise, but I tried to stay calm. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else might happen. I grabbed an iron bar I found in the shed behind the cabin and started hitting the latch, trying to force the door open. My desperation was so great that I barely noticed when I finally managed to get it open. I burst through the door with a loud noise that echoed through the forest. I rushed out, carrying my backpack and the iron bar, not looking back. The day was almost over, and the sun was slowly disappearing behind the trees, casting everything in a dark orange hue. The walk to where I had parked my car felt longer than before. With every step, I felt like something was wrong. The silence was absolute. No wind, no bird songs, like the whole forest had gone mute. That's when, as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a figure standing at the entrance of the cabin. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, with something that looked like a hood covering its head. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking directly at me. I quickened my pace, almost running, until I spotted my car. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I felt a momentary sense of relief. But when I started the engine, I saw something that made me want to throw up from fear. On the windshield, there was another one of those circles made of dry twigs, stuck on with something that looked like mud. It was like they were leaving me one last warning. I slammed the gas pedal and sped down the dirt road, not caring about the potholes or the sound of branches scraping against the car. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I reached the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror and, for a second, I was sure I saw headlights behind me, but they disappeared almost immediately. Since that day, I've never done another solo retreat. I told a few close friends about what happened, but most of them just thought it was my imagination or the stress of trying to write something new. To this day, I still don't know what that figure was or why it seemed so interested in me. All I know is that sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night with that same feeling, the same one I had when I was in the cabin, the feeling that someone is watching me.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.